So good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Brenda Hunter. I'm Program Director for Leadership Resources.
So now we are getting to be live on Facebook, and I'll get this started as well.
Ooh. Sorry about that audio feedback. Welcome to Preaching About Money with Scott Gunn, who is hosting us this evening, and our panelists, Brenda, Ron, and Brendan. Delighted that you took your time out of your busy schedules to join us for this very important topic. I just want to quickly introduce the Episcopal Church Foundation for those of you who are not familiar with us. We are an independent and lay-led organization founded in 1949. Our mission is to help build the capacity of leadership, strategy, and finances for Episcopal congregations, dioceses, and other organizations such as camps and conference centers and other Episcopal charities. You can see our desired impacts that we seek to do, and we do this on your screen. And we do this through a variety of programs, including capital campaigns, endowments, strategic solutions, our publications, including ECF Model Practices and vestry papers. If you haven't subscribed, check out ecfbp.org after this webinar. You can subscribe for free. We publish the Vestry Resource Guide, Funding Future Ministry. We have programs for strengthening lay clergy teams with our ECF Model Teams program, and a bunch of other great stuff. Do check out our website, episcopalfoundation.org, for all of this information, and including other webinars that we have coming up. Just a few quick technical notes as we get started. Everyone is on mute to help cut down on interference if we are able to. If someone really would like to speak, I can also move people up at some point during discussion. And that will allow you to speak to our panel. But for the most part, we'll be using the chat box to communicate this evening. So if you haven't already, please look towards the upper left-hand side of your screen and hit the chat button. That box will pop out. This will allow you to put in your questions and comments. I'll be monitoring the chat box the entire time to ensure that your questions and comments are addressed if they haven't been already. And finally, I just want to note that this is being recorded and also streamed live over Facebook. So do keep that in mind for any questions or comments that might be confidential or somewhat sensitive. We are always happy to speak with you outside of this public forum. So without further ado, I will get this off your screen and hand it over to Scott.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you, everyone, the panelists, and thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening. I think it's probably a good idea for us to begin with prayer this evening. Let us pray. O God, you have created all things by the power of your word, and you renew the earth by your spirit. Give now the water of life to those who thirst for you, that they may bring forth abundant fruit in your glorious kingdom, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So I'm Scott Gunn, the Executive Director of Forward Movement, a ministry of the Episcopal Church based in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I'm here with three excellent panelists that I will now introduce. We have Ron Byrd, the Reverend Ron Byrd, who is Rector of St. Katharine's Episcopal Church in Williamston, Michigan. We have the Reverend Brenda Husson, who is Rector of St. James Madison Avenue in New York City. And we have Brendan O'Sullivan Hale, who is a layperson and preacher, which is a very, just a little editorial comment. We need more of those in our church, lay people who are preachers. He is a member of All Saints Church in Indianapolis, and he will soon be, as of Monday, taking on a new job as Canon of the Ordinary for Administration and Evangelism in the Diocese of Indianapolis. So welcome, and thank you, panelists. So what's going to happen this evening is we panelists are going to have a brief conversation among ourselves, but keeping an eye on the chat box. So if you're joining the webinar, as Brendan Hunter said, you can type your question or comment over there and we'll all see it. Just make sure, if you want everyone to see it, that you change the "to" from all panelists to all panelists and attendees, and that way everyone who's attending or presenting will see it. If you want your comment to go just to the presenters, then you can just leave it at all panelists. And please leave a comment anytime. But just to kick us off, it seems to me that money is one of the great spiritual challenges, or I guess issues around money and how to manage it are one of the great spiritual challenges of our age. For many Episcopalians, there just isn't enough money to meet basic human needs, but for many other Episcopalians, perhaps the challenge is having too much money and wanting more stuff at the expense of perhaps other things that matter more. So I'm curious for our panelists if they agree with my statement that money is one of the greatest spiritual challenges of our time. Do you agree with that? And if you do agree with that, what do you think the church should be saying to folks about that? And why don't we take these in alphabetical order by last name? So we'll start with Ron.
Well, thank you, Scott, and good evening, all, and thank you for joining us tonight for this important conversation, particularly as we enter into this season of stewardship and as we begin to have these conversations. Scott, I certainly agree with you. It's an important conversation, and it's certainly a challenge for us as we move into the 21st century. What I would say about some of that is that perhaps we need to be honest. We need to be honest with our parishioners and not be afraid to talk about money. And in those conversations, talk about how we can invite others to participate in God's mission and understand it from a very fundamental standpoint beginning there. But I would say, just as a basis to start, be very honest and really just be not to be afraid to discuss money in our parishes.
Excellent. And Brenda, I wonder if you might say if you agree, and if so, what do you think the church should be saying?
Well, I think we do live at a time when, unfortunately, the whole notion of people's worth has gotten tied up with issues like net worth and how much they make. And of course, advertising, which is entirely built around convincing you that you don't have what you need in order to be whole. So I think we start by talking about what I hope we're all talking about pretty much every Sunday, which is that our worth comes because we are both made in God's image and absolutely and irrevocably loved by God. So I think we need to start there. Your life with a sort of openness to how you use your money, because you don't need to hang on to all of it in order to feel like a whole person.
Okay, thank you. We missed a little bit of what you said there in the middle, I think, but I think we maybe got the gist of it. I hope.
I hope so too.
And Brendan, that leaves you. Maybe you would respond.
Well, so I think Brenda's remark about, worth being tied up with net worth is interesting. So I'm starting a new career, but prior to a week and a half ago, I spent 16 years as an investment consultant. And by definition, the people that I was working with had a lot of money. And one of the things that I observed is that having a ton of money is no protection from incredible anxiety about it. That this is an issue that I think affects people all over the economic spectrum, whether they have a lot of money or perceive themselves as not having much or living on the edge. And I think, there's a fair amount of shame tied up in issues of money. I don't think there's anything that is more of a true quantification of our choices. And so we see that in how we spend money we have or how we spend money we don't have and the debts we accumulate and things like that. And the church needs to be a place that tells the truth about that and helps people find their way through the truth of whatever situation they happen to be in, money-wise.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much to all three of you. Another topic for us perhaps to discuss briefly is that stewardship is often used in church circles as a churchy word, a euphemism for fundraising. We start talking about stewardship, and what we really mean, if you scratch the surface even a little, is how do we get enough revenue to fund our budget? And so I wonder if just for a second we could set aside any concerns for institutional fundraising and actually talk about stewardship for a second in the more, the older sense of the word of being the steward or the caretaker of the gifts that God has given us. So I wonder if any of you would just care to talk about for a moment in terms of preaching about money. And it's an extension of the last question, really, but what do people need to hear about being caretakers of what God has given us, quite apart from institutional fundraising, just as caretakers? So why don't this time we go, let's see, by alphabetical order by first name. So why don't we start with Brenda now?
Okay, I'm going to hope my audio works this time. I think that one of the ways that I always want to start is getting people to really consider the fact that everything they have actually is a gift. And for people who are highly accomplished and work very hard, it can sometimes take a little work for them to understand that nonetheless the education they received, the work they've been able to find, that those are in fact gifts that have come to them. But part of why I really always want to focus on generosity is that everyone is capable of it, because it doesn't depend on how much money you have. Someone who has very little money, but, perhaps lives on a fixed income and yet does a tithe from that is actually a lot more generous than someone who may have millions, but can write a check for $10,000. Generosity is not actually determined by a dollar amount. And so I always want to have that back and forth between God's generosity and our being able to respond that way out of the gifts we have been given.
Absolutely, yes. I couldn't agree more. Thank you. And Brendan?
So I try to avoid using the word stewardship at all, precisely because it is so often used as a euphemism. Although I've been around the church long enough that out of habit, I can't quite get it all the way out of my vocabulary. But I do think it's interesting to look at the image of the steward that you see in Jesus' parables, right? That is a person, and often those parables happen to be about money. But what's happening in terms of what the responsibility of the steward is with respect to the money is that the steward is supposed to be magnifying the assets of the master. And in the same way, we're supposed to be using our resources. And I think Brenda stated the fullness of the resources that are available to us to magnify, multiply God's kingdom here on earth. And so that goes to the choices that we make about all of our resources. Including but not limited to money.
Right. Yes. Again, couldn't agree more. And Ron, how about you?
Just following up on what Brendan said concerning responsibility, I think stewardship is a responsibility. And we have to express that in our preaching and in our conversations with those given into our care. It is a responsibility that we have. And we have to be certainly aware of what we can do with what resources we do have, what we're called to do, and understanding that God gives us all that we need. We live abundant lives. And it's the way in which we take those resources that we have and how we use it to build God's kingdom. So we have all that we need. We need to talk about that, but we need to be aware of what we can do with the resources that we have to build God's kingdom and do the work that God has called us to do.
Right on. And thank you. So this one's a more straightforward question, but I don't know if it's an easy one. I'm curious for all three of you, what is your favorite Bible story about money? And this time we'll go in order of how you're showing up on my screen, which I don't know how that corresponds to your screen, but that means we're starting with Brendan.
So I guess mine isn't quite a story, and it's not quite about money, but it is about wealth. And so I'm thinking specifically here about the instructions in Leviticus 12 about the purification rituals following childbirth, and the note that that sort of the standard sacrifice is to be a lamb and a pigeon or a turtle dove. But then it goes on to say that if a family can't do that, then you can take 2 pigeons or 2 turtle doves. And so there are a couple things that I take from that. One is that the law is looking out for the interests of the entire community. Second, that everybody, whether of great means or low means, has a responsibility and an ability to give. And then I guess just to connect this to a story, clearly, this little passage here comes up again in Luke when Joseph and Mary present Jesus at the temple. The sacrifice they are bringing is the turtle doves. And so I think that makes an important point about the economic identity of the incarnate God.
Right on. Thank you. How interesting. Leviticus. I love it. And Ron, you're up next.
I guess my favorite is the widow's mite. When Jesus is sitting at the temple and watching the wealthier people put gifts into the temple. And Jesus calls his disciples over and begins to speak to them about the poor woman that comes up and puts 2 talents in, which is worth a couple cents. And the message in that story is really a message to me about sacrificial giving. We talk about biblical tithe in the church, which is a good goal, and certainly a way maybe to work towards, if that's where you feel your heart is. But I think ultimately God is asking for us into a sacrificial giving, what it is that we give unto others into God's mission, for God's mission. So the widow mite really speaks to me. And I think it's one that perhaps would speak to a lot of those that we're speaking to out there. It's not about, as Brenda said earlier, not about how much money you have, or even about how much you give. It's where that giving comes from. And for me, it's important that, I measure that quite often, that we give in a sacrificial way. Much like we understand that even as Brendan talked about, back in ancient biblical times where there were sacrifices made at the altar. I think that's too what we should be thinking about in terms of our money in that expression. But the widow mite speaks mightily to me.
Thank you. It's just as an aside, I once had an interesting conversation with a parishioner when I was a parish priest, whose pledge was $1 a week, so $52 a year. And this person told me that I should stop making them feel guilty or harassing them about their pledge. I wasn't personally, but just generically. And they used the example of the widow's mite and how generous $52 was compared to the widow's mite. And we had to have a little impromptu Bible study about what the widow's mite actually is, which is quite generous. Anyway, so Brenda, on to you.
It's not the story that I would use to preach if I were preaching stewardship. It's more for a Bible study. But I actually love last Sunday's gospel about the landowner and the workers who work all day and are promised the usual daily wage and receive that, but are really put out. When people who have worked far less, in their estimation, are paid that same amount. I think where you are in your own economic life has a huge bearing on whether you hear that story as something that sets your teeth on edge or actually makes you feel incredibly grateful for a vision where, even if you have just gotten that job, you actually get paid a living wage. I think there is so much to unpack there, including, I think, often something that goes back for many of us to our childhood, where if someone else gets the same gift I get, somehow we feel like our gift has been devalued. And I think that sort of strange competitiveness is really a helpful thing to unpack with folks.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Scott, I think it's
Yeah, please.
I just wanted to add that I think it's important, too, to think about that, it's often said that Jesus talked about money more than anything else in the Bible. It's a scripture over and over again that we come across in talking about money. And it goes back to what I said earlier about being, in our preaching, being able to use these different biblical texts to help those that are listening to us understand that we, again, don't have to be afraid about it, but that money is very real and is not a dirty word, and it is important in all of what we do. And it's really how we respond to that money.
No, exactly. So our last question in this segment there, where we panelists are sort of talking amongst ourselves, is we just talked about stewardship being bigger than institutional fundraising, but we are, in fact, in the season when in a lot of congregations across our church, people will be giving stewardship sermons and talking about money and engaging in fundraising and having all kinds of different conversations about stewardship. So we would be remiss if we didn't talk about that. And I wonder if our panelists would give some tips or examples of how you've been able to preach or how you might like to preach about in this season about talking to people about their generosity toward the church. And I'll just give a little example myself. When I was a parish priest, I would always make it a point to, because our staff salaries were public and in the budget and not hidden in any way, people would know what my compensation was. So I would, on one Sunday or other, preach a sermon and remind everyone how much they were paying me, and also talk about how much I was giving to the church with a dollar amount. Because I think my thinking there was that some people might not, because if we keep it, if we're ashamed of our giving amounts and we don't ever talk about it, someone might think that giving to the church is like giving to NPR, and $120 is quite generous, which for some people it could be, don't get me wrong, but for many, many people in Episcopal churches, $120 isn't generous, so sometimes it helps to hear that people might be giving different amounts, and why, and not just the amount, but why, the joy that it brings. So anyway, enough about me. Let's move on to all of you. Why don't we go back to alphabetical order of last name and start with you, Ron?
Well, that's good. Thank you, Scott. It's always a challenge, I think, but also fun to speak about stewardship. But I think you're right on. I think we need to be, again, honest with our listeners in terms of what we give and how we understand that giving back. I know when I published my giving to my parish, and I spoke specifically about the amount of money I was given and how I related to that, my stewardship went up, right? I'm also reminded that, in my years in the church, and not just as a priest, but as a treasurer, some folks will give the same amount for 20 years because that's what they give. And there has to be some understanding of how they relate to that as well. So I often talk about my own approach. I think it's also important to talk about how the money is used, not just in the parish, but also how it's used on a church-wide basis. I know when I, again, spoke about stewardship a few years ago and began to relate my sermons and talk about where the money was going at the diocesan level, and how much we gave to the diocese and what that money was used for, and also talked about the money that the diocese gave to the wider church and what that money was used for. I think of programs like ERD, Church for Life, Nets for Life, etc. Stewardship went up because people could see a direct relation between what they were given and how it was used in the broader church. So I think that's very important as well. I often say finally that we have to make a distinction when we preach about stewardship between time, talent, and treasure. We often mix these three together, time, talent, and treasure. God wants our time, our talent, and our treasure, not one to substitute the other, not that one is part of the other. And so when we're talking about stewardship, we can leave time to another occasion. For example, in our parish, we have what's called Mission and Outreach Center. That's when we talk about use of time and those type of resources. But when we're talking about money, we need to talk about money. And so oftentimes, as you said, that gets confused or get cloudy in there because we'll say stewardship is time, talent, and money. Yes, it is. But when we're talking about money, we need to keep the focus on money and the use of money in that way in the church.
Right, thank you. And Brenda, on to you.
I really try and get people, when we are talking about money, to really focus on what it is that the parish community and the wider community of the church means for them in terms of their own spiritual life. I talk directly about my own giving. I think people sometimes think the clergy actually don't make a pledge or a financial commitment, and we all do. And I certainly tithe. But I also think that it's not helpful. It's not been helpful in my experience to talk about, various programs specifically, or even the budget specifically. We have all that information available. You can find it. But I think once you do that, in my experience, people decide to quibble about something in the budget or think, well, that may be a great program, but it doesn't connect to me. And so for me, it's really getting them to think about what would my life be like if I did not have this community helping me to grow, challenging me to grow, calling me out into mission and service in Jesus' name, teaching me what it means to build the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. So I really try and focus there with folks.
Right, thank you. And Brendan.
Well, I just want to agree heartily with Ron's point that when you're talking about money, let's talk about money. So say what you mean. Avoid euphemisms. I think that's a challenge that I've given to myself that I haven't necessarily always succeeded at, but it's something that I aspire to. The other thing I think that I've tried to do in talking about money is that where my spirituality around financial giving has grown is around this idea of dollars as I said earlier, a quantification of your choices. And so Jesus says that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Note that the heart follows the treasure. And as I've made sort of the move in my life over the past, 8 years or so, from being one of those, $100 a month pledgers to getting to 10%, I've noticed a personal transformation in myself. And I think that's important to share. That yes, we owe it to people to be transparent about the finances of the church and what the money does. But ultimately, this sacrificial giving is about our souls too. The last thing that I'll say is that, as I mentioned earlier, there's some shame and vulnerability tied up with money. And so I try to be vulnerable about it myself. Again, not every sermon doesn't work all the time, but I do share the story that I think the first time I made a pledge to the church, I was 23, 24 years old, and that first year, one time I bounced a check to the church. And when people are making a big pledge for the first time, they're going out on a limb. And I think it's important for people to know that, sacrificial giving is risky and scary. And it's okay, maybe not totally okay to fail, but we all fail, and there's forgiveness for that. And so being open about my own vulnerability is important to me.
No, right on. I read a great article some years ago that I didn't keep about a church where they tried a 90-day program, tried tithing for 90 days. And if at the end of the 90 days you regretted your decision to tithe, you could call the church office and get all your money back. And of course, what it is it's a chance for people to try out having their treasure lead their heart somewhere. And 90 days is long enough, maybe, for your treasure to pull your heart along. And in that article, as I remember it, they maybe not everybody continued to tithe, but I don't believe they had to issue any refunds. But I was always intrigued by that. We have a question from Beth, who talks about something that I think you acknowledged, Brendan, and others, that the word stewardship has been tainted by using as a as a euphemism for fundraising. And Beth is wondering what other biblically grounded words or terms we can use, or how do we go about talking about money in our churches in a way that's not euphemisms, that's direct and biblical. So I'll throw it open to any of you panelists who care to respond.
Well, I'll just observe, I guess, that when Jesus talks about money, he just talks about money. So I'm not entirely...
Good point.
I'm not entirely convinced of the need to develop an alternative vocabulary, but certainly, there is no shortage of examples in Scripture, whether Jesus' teachings or elsewhere in the Bible, of ways to talk about money in a biblical fashion. I responded to another question in the chat box somebody had raised going into Leviticus. Leviticus is, a book I think we tend not to look at very much for some rather infamous reasons. But if you go back and look for the economic vision there, you can find, I think, some very fertile ground for some very solid preaching.
Right on. It actually makes me very sad when people say they won't read Leviticus, because I agree there are painful, difficult places there, but there is so much goodness as well. So thanks for reminding us of that. Ron or Brenda, you don't have to respond, but do you care to say anything about alternatives to using churchy language like stewardship and so forth? Do you want to add anything to what Brendan said? I see Brenda's ready.
I actually, I like using the word stewardship and really helping people understand it, which is why I don't just want to talk about and don't actually talk about programs and budgets when I'm doing that, because then it is just fundraising. But I also agree about being direct. One of the things that I ask people to do, because it is where your treasure is, there will your heart be also, that the treasure often leads us. I ask people to look back at a month in their calendar and a month in their checking account and their credit card statements, and ask them if that really, what it says about what people would think their values were if they saw that. And does it show what they wanted to show? And to think, therefore, about how to change what they are doing with their money and with their time. I ask people to look at their calendars and see what a difference they might want to make and what they're actually doing, perhaps sometimes even unconsciously. So I agree about being direct, and being direct also in terms of our own struggles. I said before I tithe, but I've talked about a time when, because of a family situation that went on, we had to cut back. We couldn't do it, and then eventually have worked our way back. So I think directness always helps.
Yes, thank you. And Ron, you look like you're ready to say something as well.
Just a small comment. I've started more stewardship sermons with this old preachers saying that the church has all the money it needs. The problem is in your pocket. And so we have to make that transition. So I agree with Brendan and Brenda. We do have to be honest about it. And we do have to talk about money just as Jesus talked about money. Again, with Brenda's comments there, I've used, examples of where our priorities are. Many of us spend more money on our cell phone or our cable bill than we in a month than maybe we give to the church. What's important to us, and to be direct and very direct and help people understand that. And so that's really the approach I take when I talk about money, is to go straight to the money piece and have people talk about and understand what their priorities are.
Right. Thank you. We had a question in the chat box and on Facebook about the comment that I made about sort of reminding everyone what was already in the budget, my compensation as a priest. Questions, did that generate pushback? And also questions about did that turn out to be effective? And I think Brenda talked about sharing her giving and Ron also, how it was effective. And so, yes, I think it was, in my experience, very effective to do that. I also, by the way, when I was a parish priest, invited other parishioners to share their giving amount they didn't have to say their salary, but they would talk about their pledge to the church, why they were giving it, and the dollar amount, to try to erase some of the mystery around this how good it feels, for a school teacher to make a $5,000 pledge, a $5,000 annual pledge. And you could sort of see the eyebrows shoot up because that might be a different amount than some people would have expected. But here's a person talking about the joy of it. In terms of pushback, they weren't paying me very well, so no one was too concerned about that. But I think what Brenda said is true. We put our financial reports on. Well, she didn't say this, but transparency is important, and we put our financial reports online every month, and including breakouts of staff salary. There just were no mysteries. And sure, somebody might grouse occasionally that why do we have to pay the organist so much, or can't we cut here, or why are we spending so much on paper clips, or the rector costs too much. But mostly, publishing all that completely undercuts the power of people who might grouse, because then it becomes a conversation about, well, if you're concerned, here's how to share your concern, and it takes away the mystery of the secrecy of it all. And changes that and puts the conversation in a more healthy and productive place, I think. But I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything to that.
I would, Scott, because as I said, I've shared that information. But I think it's also a part of the education. Many, I think, oftentimes do not know or do not understand or have no idea that they're $10,000 or $15,000 givers in the parish, right? And so I think it puts it into perspective for some and where their giving is. So I think it helps to share the numbers in terms of particularly what clergy is giving, because we are the examples. Now, whether or not everyone in the congregation stands up and say what they're giving, it helps for people to understand what the level of giving is in some areas, in some places. Because as I said earlier, you can find that people will give that $100 for 20 years. And they think that that's where they should be. But when they understand that the level of giving is much greater, people tend to respond to that. And it certainly has been successful in my parish.
Brenda or Brendan, do you care to respond? You don't have to.
I would just add that we also have parishioners, usually for several weeks before our Stewardship Sunday, talk about their life in the church and the effect that has had on their decision to give. And some of them share very directly about what they give. But again, they're really talking about when I think about, what I give to the other things that are important, and realize actually this is more important than those. And I had to change my giving. But hearing that from their peers is very powerful for folks.
Right. Oh, Brendan.
Yeah, no, I was just going to agree with that. I think clergy are sometimes in a difficult position where they, a cynical congregation can look at you as just trying to get your salary, right? And so I think it is important for lay voices to be there and to express very directly, how it is that what motivates their giving and how it is that giving has changed their lives.
Right. I'm curious about a couple more questions, but I want to go off on a slightly related direction, building on something that Brenda talked about, this idea of beginning to try to teach and understand that everything we have is a gift from God, this sense of grace and nurturing gratitude in ourselves and in the people we serve. But also part of that that is creating a culture of generosity. And I wonder if anyone would care to comment, do you think it's important to try to create a culture of generosity? How do you do that? Just a couple things come to mind from my parish priest days. One of them was there was a tendency where I served in New England to have a very kind of transactional model of things where there would often in many churches be a sign at coffee hour, coffee is $1. If the church had pamphlets, like I said, it's working at Forward Movement, there'd be a little sign, pamphlets are 50 cents or whatever. Weddings, you get a discount if you're a member. There was this kind of transactional idea that that things cost and you got something in return. And one of the things that we tried to do was erase all that by by the coffee's free. It's a gift. If you're grateful, do something nice for somebody, or give money to the church. But it's a gift. We took away all those transactional signs and member discounts and all that stuff to try to create a grace economy. And we stopped talking about the church's need for money and talked about our need to give, just generically, our human need to give, and as followers of Jesus. But I wonder if anyone has tried to create a culture of generosity, and did it work, and what did you do to try that?
I fear my internet connection is not very good. Am I coming through at this point?
You are.
Okay. We were never that transactional, but we did have parish events and became aware that some people didn't think they could go because they couldn't pay for whatever it was. So we've changed almost all of them now are pay what you wish. And what we've discovered is that, some people don't pay, some people double or triple pay for other folks, and it's fine. We managed to get everything covered. But it's about what you're able to do. And we don't want you not to come to something for the whole parish because you may not feel like you can meet that fee. But we never have charged for coffee or those forward movement pamphlets.
Excellent.
Well, we still have the little box where you can put your coins in for the forward movement. But, we got away from that a long time ago, Scott. We don't charge for anything anymore. Membership has its privileges. So when we do programs and things here at the church, it's a response to what people have already given. So we design our programs and the work that we do around that. And so when we have different events here, we don't charge for anything. That's just a basic rule that we do. The other thing I want to say about stewardship, and this is a little sidetrack from our conversation now, is mission. People will tend to respond to churches that are involved in missions in their community and respond in ways in terms of giving. And so when we were talking about preaching a few minutes ago, I just wanted to add that because that came to mind to me, that when we're out and we're in terms of generosity and giving to those in our community and doing things in our community and participating in what God is doing in the world, numbers, again, in my view, or what I've experienced, tend to go up. And people want to be a part of that. And so, no, we don't charge for church-wide events. We try to do it out of our budget. If we can't afford it, but we work those out of our budget. And so I always say to folks that membership does have its privileges and being a part of this community. And getting away from this notion of what I call, several years ago, nickel and diming people. Every month or every week, we got a fundraiser for this, a fundraiser for that, and nickel and diming people. Their pledge is sufficient. And once we moved items from all of those various categories into the pledge line, things begin to stabilize.
It's difficult for me to speak to my particular parish doing something to explicitly generate a culture of generosity. I'm not sure that we've done that, at least not in so many words. But I will note that, fostering a culture of financial giving to the church, I think, is a way of creating that culture of generosity. So I mentioned sort of a personal transformation in my life as a result of being serious about my pledge. And one of those is that it has made me more fearless in generosity, in ways that, frankly, sometimes have gotten me in trouble and have resulted in some cash crunches. But it's the kind of trouble I haven't regretted. That may not be the same for everybody. I can't say for sure, but certainly that's been the case for me, and I hope that I'm not unique in that regard.
Right. Yeah, thank you. There's a question that we got, and I'm glad it came up because I was actually wondering about addressing this myself. Brendan Hunter writes, and I'm not sure, Brendan, if this is from you or you got it from Facebook, but in my parish, it says we're abandoning the use of the word stewardship entirely and instead talking about the fall pledge campaign to emphasize that this is fundraising season. In the past, there was obfuscation and now it's just talking about that as a fundraising season. And I know when I'm not traveling, hang my ecclesiastical hat, as it were, at Christ Church Cathedral in Cincinnati. And the terminology this year is shifting, and they're calling the campaign this year the annual appeal. So using what I might otherwise think of as a secular term to describe these conversations we're going to have around money this fall. I wonder if our panelists would care to say what you think of that, of having straight up conversations about institutional fundraising when that's what we want to talk about.
And that question comes courtesy of Ben on Facebook. So thank you, Ben, for asking that. And again, would invite our folks watching on Facebook Live as well to put your comments on the post, and I will relay them over to Scott.
Well, I, for one, enthusiastically agree with calling it the Fall Pledge Campaign and excising the word stewardship. We do the same thing. Like I said earlier, I can't say for sure that the word stewardship doesn't sneak in there. Sometimes old habits are hard to break, but I think that's a great idea.
Brenda, you seem to have, I was just going to say, Brenda, you seem to have another take on this. So maybe this will be our first big disagreement. How exciting.
Yeah, I really do. And maybe it's because I live in a city where everything has an annual appeal. And that puts us right up there with the schools and the hospitals. And, you know, I'm hoping people are understanding about the joy of giving. And when it's an annual appeal, I'm doing that out of a sense of sometimes obligation, sometimes gratitude for what's happened in the past when I give to my college. But stewardship is about opening up areas that I didn't expect to. And so I'm finding it funny with Brendan because I'm all about the risk taking. And I think something like an annual appeal, for me, doesn't lead people to take risks. It makes them think, what are the do's? You know, what are other people doing here in a way that feels very narrow to me? So I'm sticking with stewardship.
Excellent. I like the divergent views, and maybe Ron will be the tiebreaker or offer a third option.
I am the tiebreaker. Thank you, Scott, because I agree with both Brenda and Brendan.
Very Anglican of you.
I live in a university town. The University of Michigan State University is right down the street from our church, about 7 miles. And they have annual appeals in this community. And so we hear that secular term quite often associated with Michigan State University and some of the other bigger organizations around here. In my parish, we also have an adult day center that we run for seniors with dementia and other disabilities. We do an annual appeal for that center, right? So that's a different type of setting where we raise money and we do fundraising for the adult day center. So I think in terms of what Brendan said and Brenda said, it depends on context and where you are and know your surroundings, whether that will work or not in terms of an annual appeal. If you remember years ago, in the early days, being a cradle Episcopalian, we used to do what we would call every member canvass, right? Where we would canvass every member to participate in this annual appeal or pledge drive. So I just think we have to be careful and understand our context and where we are and who we're talking to, whether we use stewardship, primarily in terms of language. I'm speaking primarily language here, right? Semantics versus annual appeal.
And just to be clear, I'm not really a fan of the annual appeal phrase for exactly the reasons that Brenda and Ron have cited. I was agreeing enthusiastically with the term pledge campaign, which I suppose still risks putting you in sort of public radio territory, but at least fewer cultural associations.
Great. Okay. So this is a new thing for me here in the ECF webinar, but Wendy has her hand raised, proverbial hand raised, and Brendan Hunter is going to do some magic, and if Wendy will unmute herself, I believe he's going to magically make it so that she can ask us a question by audio.
Yes, so Wendy, if Wendy is there, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
She may have stepped away, waiting while
You
we
may
were.
have stepped away. Oh, I see she's unmuted her.
Didn't realize I had waved. It was an accident.
Oh, not to worry. Okay, so we will put you back.
Scott, can I add one more thing connected to the last piece?
Of course you can.
You know, when we talk about annual appeal 2, stewardship should be a year-round conversation. It should not be, and in my view, it should be a year-round conversation and not, you know, maybe one just set for October or September when we have it. But we should always be talking about stewardship in one term or another. Now, then I would allow the conversation to come in, as you will, around time and talent and treasure. But I think we should always be talking about stewardship in terms of God's grace and generosity towards us and giving back those gifts. I would tell you just a brief story that I do know to be true, that there was a preacher in the Episcopal Church who took that approach to talk about stewardship regularly. And their budget went up significantly because it was just a regular conversation and people were used to hearing about it on a number of levels. Their participation went up, their budgets went up, or their level of giving went up because it was something that people were used to. It wasn't this one season set aside, let's talk about money and forget it the next 11 months of the year. But in my view, I think it's something that we should talk about on a regular basis.
No, I agree. One thing I'm hoping our panelists, you've been answering very quickly, so thank you, but be especially quick because we have 8 minutes left, so I want to try to cover this topic and leave room for one more if our audience has a question or a topic for us. But I'm mindful of the fact that statistics tell us that in any church, many people in the congregation will be awash in debt, credit card debt, car payments, mortgages. Just as a society, we're up to our eyeballs in debt, statistically speaking. And practically speaking, that means it's hard to make a very large pledge to the church because you're paying all your money off in interest to various banks. But I wonder, this is not the time for a kind of finance seminar on how to pay down credit card debt. But I do wonder, theologically, maybe it's an amplification of what Brenda said earlier about our self-worth, and Brenda, about our self-worth. What can the church, or should the church be saying, recognizing the challenging financial realities that many of our parishioners and staff will be feeling?
I'm not sure I have a full answer to this question, Scott, but I'll take a stab at a little piece of it, which is that, no matter how much you come at financial giving from an abundance mentality, math is still a thing. And so numbers need to add up somehow. And I think we need to be candid with people and thinking about the trade-offs. So just speaking from my own experience, I made a series of unwise choices earlier in my life, and I'm still living with the consequences of those. I've got a pile of credit card debt that I've chosen not to pay off as quickly as I would like in order to prioritize the church. Now, everybody's going to have to do their own math on that, and everybody's got different situations. But there are trade-offs that are real. And I think we have to be honest about that. And, I'm also aware that many clergy are in this situation as well, whether it's student loan debt most prominently or the same debts that everybody else has. This is a struggle that is, I think, probably close to universal in our church. And we need to be honest about it and create a safe place for people to talk about it without shame.
Scott, I'll just say this. I know since I started tithing long ago, I have not necessarily missed the tithe, and my own level of, if you want to call it wealth or well-being, maybe is a better word, has increased. And so, and I've talked about that several times in my own message here at St. Catherine's. But I just know since I've started tithing, there's been a direct relation to me, to my tithing and my generosity, to how Ronald Byrd is doing personally, not just on a financial level, but on a spiritual level, on a mental level, on a physical level. And so I just tie the two together. And so that would be my response. God takes care of us. to His abundance, to God's abundance.
I would agree with Ron.
Oh no, we lost you, Brenda, there.
That I have been thinking for some time and need to get on it about actually pulling together an opportunity in a small group for people to be able to talk about debt and how to work their way through it. Issue. I marital counseling with us all the time, but there needs to be a more general opportunity for people to come together without feeling exposed and get some advice about how to prioritize and how to work your way down from that debt, because it's a huge issue.
Right. Yes, thank you. And by the way, a commenter, Richard Proctor, says that his church has been hosting a Financial Peace University course, and I know that has worked very well for people in some other Episcopal churches as well. And there are other programs like it, but it's an opportunity for people to talk theologically about their financial situation and also practically, and learn some financial skills and learn how to pay down debt and so forth. So we are very close to the end of our time. Is that right, Brendan? So maybe very quickly in a tweet length reply, does anybody on our panel want to add one last thought as we're just about ready to wrap up, something you've just been burning to say and didn't have a chance yet? And if not, Ron's there. Okay, Ron.
No, I just want to say, never give a preacher a chance to talk. But no, I'm done. I just came to my mind. But no, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I would just add, one of the questions that came up was, is there a stewardship sermon that you remember? And we didn't get a chance to talk about that, but I'll just take a little moderator's privilege here. And one that I remember when I was a curate, the rector I served with had read about something, and we did it at our church. A parishioner donated a fairly large sum of cash, several $1,000s. And one Sunday, it's a little gimmicky, but we passed out envelopes to everyone who was in church that day. They didn't know that this was happening in advance. And every envelope had somewhere between $5 and $100 in it, cash. And it was a free gift. The only stipulation was you couldn't put it in the offering plate that Sunday. You could take it home and bring it back next Sunday. You could go out to dinner if that's what you needed. Use it to help pay your rent, give it away, do anything you wanted to it. And then we invited people to tell their stories of what they did with this gift. And it was quite extraordinary what people did with $10 here, $20 there, $50 there. This free gift. And of course, then it doesn't take much more to connect the dots and say, well, if you were able to get this much joy from $20, that was a free gift. Think of what it's like in your whole life to realize that everything is a gift. And how would it be if we treated our resources always with this much joy and care? It was wonderful. So thank you, panelists, and thank you, participants. I'll turn it back to Brendan to close us out.
Wonderful. Thank you, Scott. And thank you to our panelists as well. This was really wonderful and I hope very valuable to everyone who's participated in the webinar this evening. We are going to be wrapping up and do invite you though to email us or call us if you have any additional questions. Do check out the resources that are available on Forward Movement as well as the Episcopal Church Foundation. There are a bunch of wonderful, great free things out there. TENS as well as another great organization that has some great resources. I do want to also ask all of you to, instead of moving away from your computer, to go and open up your email inbox, because in the next couple of seconds, an email will be arriving there with a link to a survey. And I just invite you and ask you to take a few minutes to provide your feedback on tonight's webinar. We'll of course share this with with Scott and with our panelists who presented this evening, and as well as use all of your comments and feedback for planning our future webinars and other online events. So again, thank you all. God bless and have a good night.